Sikh houses and temples have been torn down and set on fire. There have been reports of Sikhs being burnt alive, and Hindu mobs 100 strong attacking women and children. The families who've not been able to flee the city are in hiding, barricaded in their homes. For many months, the Sikhs have been demanding, often violently, a bigger say in their own affairs. Now, the Hindus are fighting back. Sikhs are not reassured. They say their Hindu neighbours turned a deaf ear to their cries. Some Sikhs claim to have telephoned police stations for help again and again, but received no response.
The overwhelming Hindu majority in the capital was out for revenge. They burned stores, taxis and buses, anything that could be identified as owned by Sikhs. Many in the crowd tried to keep television cameras away from the violence, but one cameraman caught this horrifying sight on tape.
Though we're not getting any safety or any protection from police, this I want to stress.
Half of our property we have lost it. Everything has been burnt.
They give with bricks, they give with stones, they give with iron rods, iron sheets.
What can we do?
Our shop is burnt, our house is burnt. Only we have saved ourselves. Nothing is there.
It seems as if every Sikh here now has a tale of senseless violence. Their community is horribly scarred. 3 generations of the Saransit Singh family are now homeless. Frightened people are still huddling for safety at a local temple, where others are being treated for their wounds. This old man was beaten and burned. Another had one ear sliced off. Johan Singh was defiled in the worst possible way for a Sikh, as his sacred beard and hair were shorn off. His wife showed us a picture of how he used to look. They don't blame their neighbors. They say it was Hindus from outside who attacked their town, but they are now forced to live with a fear and suspicion they've never known. In
our own country. We don't want to leave our country.
The question haunting this town now is whether the next generation will feel the same way. Mark Litke, ABC News, Sultanpuri.
They killed our relatives. Her husband, her father, her brother burnt alive in front of their houses.
It has all left scars. Bitter feelings between Hindus and Sikhs, anger fueled at least in part by pictures like this. Whomever the Hindu mob did not burn, it drowned. The government said that for those who had lost a house or a family member, there would be a settlement of something less than $900. For those injured, less than $200. Police officials have been removed from office, and the charge is that in the early days, police did nothing.
And at least for a day or two, I think no government existed at all as far as problems of law and order are concerned.
They are the sobs of a nation that has suddenly turned on itself. A white-hot rage that began when Hindus started taking revenge on all Sikhs because 2 Sikhs shot Indira Gandhi.
They have mercilessly killed everybody.
Every town, every city, every village, they are hunting for Sikhs.
This woman's husband was pulled from their home and burned alive while she and her 5 children watched. Sikhs have been pulled from their taxis, beaten on trains. A mob pinned down this 7-year-old child and cut his shoulder-length hair, a crime akin to rape for Sikhs who don't cut their hair. The 4-day spree of violence has turned the Sikhs into refugees in their own city. The Sikhs are virtual prisoners in the schools and temples where they have isolated themselves for safety. In Delhi, the harassment and murder of Sikhs often happened in front of the police. The Sikhs looked for protection. The cops looked away.
Missing part of it, that when the police themselves cannot protect the citizens, then there's very little a man can do to protect himself.
Newsmen trying to tell the story of the Sikhs are kept away by police. CBS News crews that slip past security were often chased away by scores of angry Hindus who don't want the story told. For the Sikhs, it's as if they've instantly dropped to the bottom of India's caste system. Prosperous and wealthy one week, they're camping in temples the next. Some Sikh government officials are too scared to work, teachers afraid to go to school.
This is inexplicable. I just can't explain.
The damage done to the Sikhs, while brutal and physical, is also social. After decades of living in what they thought was a tolerant city, 4 days of madness exposed the lie.
Some of the worst violence took place in Trilokpuri, a suburb of Delhi where Sikhs and Hindus lived in close quarters.
हिंदुस्तानी कहण लगे हुण सरदारां नूं अहीं छड्डना नहीं तां अग्गों अहीं तो ਇਹੋ सोचिया अहीं क्या भी ਇਹ ਤਾਂ ਮਾਂ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਦੀ ਸੀਗੀ इंदिरा गांधी चलो राज करदी ਸੀਗੀ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਸੀਗੀ
ਉਹਨੂੰ ਖਿੱਚ ਕੇ ਲਿਆਏ ਅੰਦਰੋਂ ਫਿਰ ਅੰਦਰੋਂ ਖਿੱਚ ਕੇ ਤੋਂ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਡੰਡਾ ਮਾਰਿਆ ਸੀ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਫਿਰ ਜਿੰਦੇ ਨੂੰ ਜਲਾਇਆ ਸੀ ਫਿਰ ਮੇਰੀ ਕੁੜੀ ਛੋਟੀ ਸੀ ਮੇਰੇ ਗੋਦੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਤਾਂ ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਆਦਮੀ ਨੂੰ ਬਚਾਣ ਗਈ ਤਾਂ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਖਿੱਚ ਕੇ ਤਾਂ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਸੁੱਟ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਤੂੰ ਬਈ ਐਨਵੇ ਹਟੋ ਤੇ ਮੇਰੀ ਕੁੜੀ ਵੀ ਉੱਠ ਚੁੱਕ ਕੇ ਤਾਂ ਥੱਲੇ ਸੁੱਟ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਸੀ ਫਿਰ ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਉਹਨੇ ਜਿੰਦੇ ਨੂੰ ਸਾੜ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਸੀ ਤੇ 18 ਜੋ ਛੋਟਾ ਮੁੰਡਾ ਸੀ 10-12 ਸਾਲ ਦਾ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਮਾਰਿਆ 6-7 ਲਾਸ਼ਾਂ ਇਕੱਠੀ ਕਰਕੇ ਇੱਕ ਦੂਜੇ ਤੇ ਫਿਰ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਸਾੜ ਦਿੱਤਾ
ਜ਼ਬਰਦਸਤੀ ਉੱਤੇ ਬੁਲਾ ਕੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਧੱਕਾ ਦੇ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਉੱਤੋਂ ਸੁੱਟ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਉੱਤੋਂ ਹੀ ਮਿੱਟੀ ਦਾ ਤੇਲ ਪਾ ਕੇ ਸਰੀਏ ਆਪਣੇ ਤਲਵਾਰਾਂ ਨਲਕੇ ਦੀਆਂ ਹੱਥੀਆਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਮਾਰਨ ਡੈ ਪਏ ਫਿਰ ਵੀ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਵੀ ਸੀਗੇ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਚੱਲਿਆ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਮੈਂ ਤੇ ਥੱਲੇ ਸਾਂਗੀ ਜਦੋਂ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਚੱਲਿਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਮਿੱਟੀ ਦਾ ਤੇਲ ਪਾ ਕੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਲਾਤਾ ਹੈ ਵੀ ਤਿੱਲੀ ਲਗਾਈ ਹੈ ਤਰਲੇ ਲੈਣ ਡੈ ਪਏ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਉਹ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਛੱਡ ਦਿਓ ਮੇਰਾ ਬੱਚਾ ਇੱਕੋ ਹੀ ਆ ਪਰ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਛੱਡ ਦਿਓ ਬਹੁਤ ਤਰਲੇ ਲਏ
The Congress party is entirely and completely responsible for what happened in Delhi after Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. The killings, the burnings, the lootings, the rape, that is entirely due to the Congress party. They controlled the federal government in the center and they controlled the Delhi administration. Everything was under them. It could have been stopped in one day.
By the time of Mrs. Gandhi's funeral, most of the violence had subsided, but senior members of her Congress party were accused not merely of negligence but of actual complicity in the killings.
What was very clear was that there was a certain sort of methodology in the way the mobs moved. It was not a random. If Sikh houses were singled out, they had already been listed. And those lists you could get from the municipal corporation. Which properties where, who's paying how much tax, what number on what street, who's living.
As we found, police elsewhere in the city seem to prefer to stand by. Just 50 yards from police lines here, Hindu youths began stoning a Sikh building. Already people's grief is turning to anger. Here we've got a mob of Hindus attacking a Sikh premises in the middle of Delhi. The police are nowhere to be seen. And this sort of situation is expected to get worse, indeed to be repeated across the country, particularly after her funeral on Saturday. Ken Rees, ITN, Delhi. Sikhs drive most of the taxis in Delhi, and they were a major target for the mobs today. Sikh temples also came under attack. At the main temple in the center of the city, a Hindu mob threw stones and tried but failed.
Just 300 yards from the main Parliament building, and then the home of the MP was put to the torch. I was told that 6 calls were made to the police. They never turned up.
Soberbad is slightly industrialized and looks peaceful enough, with Hindus and Sikhs living close together. But this morning, 3 Sikh factories were surrounded by a mob and their contents ransacked and burnt. The few dozen Sikhs who have lived here peacefully for 16 years have lost almost everything they own. The attack went on for several hours, and it seems nobody tried to stop it.
They put fire to our factories and tried to damage our lives. We hardly rescued our life.
But theirs is a tiny tragedy. We found it by accident while asking about something else. Incidents like this are so commonplace, they go unreported.
But the Sikhs are not reassured. They say their Hindu neighbours turned a deaf ear to their cries. Some Sikhs claim to have telephoned police stations for help again and again, but received no response.
A lorry still blazes on a country track near Delhi, and we hear a horrific account of how the two Sikh drivers had been ambushed as they'd crossed a nearby bridge. They'd apparently been set alight by the mob and had either been thrown or had jumped into the river. Their bodies could still be seen there. Travelled to a refugee camp outside Delhi. The police had strict orders not to let us in, despite pleas from some of the Sikhs inside. Eventually we did get in. It was a large college building now home to thousands of terrified Sikhs living in squalor. They fled here from many miles around and told us stories of how they'd hid in places like drains and fields to avoid the rioting before eventually reaching safety. This man was a victim of the riots who survived an attempt to burn him alive. His wife tries to comfort him. We saw many more like this who lived, but many died, and their widows were mourning today. We could not move in the courtyards without bumping into or tripping over people. Many were washing outside in gutters in the road. Sikhs place great store on cleanliness, and their religion calls for an uncut beard and long hair. Many had their heads shaved by the mobs. You see, I used to look like this, said Mr. Puran Singh. His identity card showed a proud bearded man. Now he has no beard and a shorn head. The government wants to destroy us, they told us. They were eager to talk about the situation.
We are homeless, we are familyless, and moreover, above all, no safety. We can't imagine how we will survive ourselves in this India.
The camps are guarded by Indian troops and police. There are at least 3 in the Delhi area alone. At another just 3 miles away, a food lorry had arrived. The Sikhs angrily told us that they themselves had arranged it. From the government, there's almost nothing, they said. And certainly we noticed a great shortage of food, water, and other essentials. Many of the Sikhs claimed that police had stood by and watched and even encouraged the rioting. And we ourselves had seen police look idly on during last week's Anti-Sikh Riots in Delhi. A relief worker in this camp showed us his list of dead and injured. He compiled it after talking to people in just 1 block. The list contained hundreds of names. We were told stories of dreadful horror. Mothers whose children had been killed wept as they spoke. This was the story of just one 6-year-old boy we met in the camp. Can you tell us what happened to this boy?
Petrol was sprinkled on him and set on fire.
He was set on fire? Why?
Because he is a Sardarji.
That's a Sikh. His mother looked on. She was too dazed to speak. The Indian government is telling everybody that the situation is normal. There's nothing to worry about, indeed claiming that many of the reports of trouble were grossly exaggerated. But at 2 camps today, we've seen something like 20 or 30,000 people, many of them living in appalling conditions, some are suffering from terrible injuries. They're now homeless and they think friendless as well.